The day my boss fired me, I thought my career was over. But when he replaced me with his incompetent nephew, he didn't just lose a loyal employee, he handed me the keys to everything he'd built. What started as betrayal became the foundation of my own empire. Before we dive into the story, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you never miss a tale of justice. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments. Okay, let's get into it. I still remember that morning as if it happened yesterday. The office smelled faintly of burnt coffee and printer ink, a smell I'd grown used to after nearly 8 years in that building. I was early, as usual, reviewing our client reports before the Monday meeting. My boss, Harold, walked in with an odd look on his face, a mixture of forced calm and concealed excitement. At first, I thought he had good news, but deep down, something in my stomach twisted. He closed the door behind him and said, "Can we talk for a moment?" The tone was off, too formal, too rehearsed. I'd spent nearly a decade helping build that small marketing agency from a 3-person startup into something respectable. I'd poured weekends, nights, and every ounce of energy into keeping our clients happy, nurturing relationships, solving crises, smoothing over Harold's mistakes when his temper got the better of him. I never asked for much in return, just honesty and fairness. So when he looked across his desk and told me that tough decisions had to be made, my mind froze. I blinked, waiting for him to say something reasonable. Maybe a restructuring, a promotion for someone else, or a temporary layoff due to budget cuts. But then he smiled, that kind of condescending smile people wear when they think they're being merciful, and said, "I'm letting you go, effective immediately." I remember my throat tightening. "You're firing me? Harold, why?" He sighed dramatically, leaning back in his leather chair like this was a burden to him. "It's not about your work, trust me. You've done excellent work, but I've decided to bring in some fresh blood, someone who can bring new energy to the team." My pulse quickened. Fresh blood? That's when he said it casually, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "My nephew Kyle. He just finished business school. I think it's time to give him a chance." For a moment, I thought I misheard him. Kyle? The same 20-something kid who'd shown up to the office Christmas party wearing sunglasses indoors, bragging about crypto investments and networking with influencers? I just stared at Harold, trying to understand how someone could say something so absurd with a straight face. I felt a heat rise from my chest, not anger yet, but disbelief. I'd built client strategies, negotiated contracts, kept us afloat when Harold's impulsive ideas nearly sank us. And now I was being replaced by a boy who once asked me if marketing and sales were basically the same thing. I managed to keep my composure. "So, I'm being replaced by your nephew." He shrugged. "It's just business, nothing personal. You'll be fine, you're talented. You'll land on your feet." I could barely process his words. "You're giving my accounts to him?" He nodded. "Of course, I'll need you to hand over everything before you leave. Files, templates, client contact lists, a clean transition." That was the moment something in me went cold. It wasn't the loss of the job itself that stung the most. It was the realization that loyalty meant nothing to him. I'd stood by that company when no one else believed in it. I'd stayed late countless nights while Harold took credit for my work in client meetings, and in return, I was being discarded like an outdated printer cartridge. Still, I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just looked him in the eye and said quietly, "Understood." Then I walked out of his office, closed the door behind me, and went back to my desk to gather my things. I remembered the silence in the office as I packed. My coworkers avoided eye contact, probably warned ahead of time. I took one last look around, the glass walls, the team photos, and the framed client awards I'd helped win. When I stepped out into the parking lot, the sunlight felt harsh, like the world itself was too bright, too indifferent. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. My mind wasn't racing. It was eerily calm, the kind of stillness that comes right before a storm. I didn't know it then, but that moment, the humiliation, the injustice, the quiet rage, was the spark that would eventually build everything I have today. At the time, though, all I could think of was he took everything I worked for and handed it to his useless nephew. Little did Harold know, he hadn't fired me. He just set me free. In the weeks that followed, I found myself replaying every memory of that office, every meeting, every laugh, every uneasy glance that in hindsight should have told me what was coming. Before everything went wrong, that place had felt like home. We were a small agency back then, maybe 15 people, all of us juggling more roles than our job titles ever suggested. I handled account management, copywriting, and sometimes even client relations when Harold, my boss, couldn't keep his temper in check. I was proud of how far we'd come. When I first joined the company, it was barely more than a handful of freelancers and one shared printer that jammed every other day. Harold back then seemed ambitious, charismatic in his own rough-edged way. He could sell a vision to clients with pure confidence, even when we didn't quite have the resources to back it up. And me, I was the one who quietly made those promises come true. We worked well together for a long time. He'd handle the big talk, I'd handle the follow-through. He'd promise results, and I'd stay up until 2 a.m. to deliver them. When the company started turning a profit, he thanked me publicly, called me the backbone of the agency. I believed him. I really did. But as the years went by and the company grew, something in him started to shift. He became obsessed with appearances, flashy cars, expensive suits, and new office decor we didn't need. I used to joke that if Harold could market himself half as well as he marketed our services, he'd be unstoppable. But somewhere along the line, his priorities changed from building something real to looking successful. That's when his nephew Kyle started appearing more often. At first, he was just a face at family events, Harold's sister's son, freshly graduated, cocky in the way people are when they've never failed before. The first time I met him was at our annual summer party. He walked right up to me with a drink in hand and said, "So you're the one who actually runs the place, huh?" I laughed politely, assuming he was joking, but the way he said it, like it was a challenge, made my skin crawl. Over the months that followed, Kyle started dropping by the office more frequently. Harold introduced him as a bright young man with fresh ideas. Those ideas, I quickly realized, mostly involved copying whatever trending buzzword he'd seen on LinkedIn that week. He talked big, but did nothing. He'd wander into meetings, interrupt mid-sentence, and offer opinions that made no sense. Once he told one of our designers to add more crypto energy to a campaign for a bakery. I remembered the confused silence that followed. Still, I tried to be patient. Harold was proud of his nephew, and I didn't want to make waves. I told myself it was temporary, maybe a family favor, maybe a short internship. But then the small things started adding up. Kyle would borrow my client files and forget to return them. He'd schedule meetings on my behalf without checking my calendar. He once sent out a client proposal riddled with spelling errors, and when the client pointed them out, Harold blamed the drafting team, meaning me. I started feeling that quiet dread that creeps in when you sense a shift you can't control. Conversation stopped when I entered the break room. Harold's tone grew colder, more dismissive. He started taking credit for ideas that had come from my meeting teams. And yet, despite all the warning signs, I still believed I was safe. I'd earned my place there. I'd built client relationships on trust and reliability. I'd trained half the junior staff myself, and above all, I thought Harold knew my worth. But I was wrong. The day he fired me, I realized that none of it mattered. Not the years of loyalty, not the late nights, not the countless times I covered for his mistakes. The truth was simple. I'd been useful to him, and once he found someone he could control, I wasn't useful. That realization hurt, but it also lit a spark. Because if I could run that agency for him, I could build something better for myself. I just didn't know yet how far he'd go to make sure I failed. A week after the firing, when the shock had just begun to dull into a heavy ache, I got an email from Harold's assistant. The subject line was simple:
transition materials. Inside was a polite but curt message. I was expected to compile all of my client documents, campaign assets, and contact information for a smooth handover to Kyle. It was like being asked to gift wrap my own replacement. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the laptop screen for a long time. My coffee had gone cold. The cursor blinked beside Harold's name as if mocking me, daring me to reply. I could almost hear his voice, so self-satisfied, so sure that I'd just roll over and do what he wanted. Part of me wanted to fire off an angry message to tell him exactly what I thought of his fresh blood, but another part of me, the more steadier, wiser part, told me to pause. I knew Harold well enough to understand that he thrived on control. If I reacted emotionally, he'd see it as validation. So I did nothing. I took
A deep breath, closed the laptop, and walked away. But that wasn't the end of it. A few days later, I started hearing from clients. Not one or two, but several. Confused and frustrated. "Hey, are you still with the agency?" one asked. "We've been trying to get updates, but no one's answering." Another said, "This new guy, Kyle, doesn't seem to understand our campaign. He told us our target audience was too old school. What does that even mean?" I tried to stay professional, telling them that I was no longer part of the company and that they should reach out to Harold directly. But then, one client, a long-term partner who'd trusted me for years, lowered his voice and said, "Between you and me, it's a mess. They're reusing your old proposals and calling them new ideas." That one hit hard. I checked the agency's public page later that evening. My stomach turned when I saw it. The latest post showcased one of my campaigns, word for word, visuals and all, except now it was labeled as concept by Kyle Richardson. The arrogance of it. The shamelessness. I'd created that entire project from scratch. The strategy, the copy, the pitch deck, and Harold had the nerve to rebrand it under his nephew's name. It wasn't just professional theft, it was personal erasure. It felt like watching someone repaint your home in garish colors and then take credit for the design. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Harold's smug face in that final meeting. The way he said, "It's just business." The words replayed like static. I began to realize that for people like him, business was just a shield for cruelty, a way to justify greed, deceit, and betrayal. Still, I told myself to stay calm, to let it go. Maybe it wasn't worth the fight. But then came the moment that changed everything. One afternoon, about 2 weeks later, I received another message, this time from Harold himself. No greeting, no pretense of civility. "We're missing key client handover data. Please send the updated campaign templates and budget notes by EOD. You're legally obligated to cooperate." I read it 3 times, each word digging deeper. He wasn't asking, he was ordering me. The same man who had fired me without cause was now accusing me of withholding materials. He was trying to make me look unprofessional, even dishonest. And that was the line. I wasn't his employee anymore. I didn't owe him anything, yet he still spoke to me like I was beneath him, like he could take everything I'd built and still make me feel small for it. I typed a simple reply. All materials belonging to the agency were returned on my final day. Anything created personally or under my own license remains my intellectual property. Please refer to your legal team for clarification. I hit send and sat back, heart pounding. I wasn't sure what consequences that email might bring,
But for the first time since losing my job, I felt a flicker of power, small but steady. Because deep down, I realized something important. Harold might have taken my position, my paycheck, and my title, but he hadn't taken my skills. He hadn't taken my relationships, or my name, or the quiet trust I'd built with people over years of honest work. That night, as I sat on my couch with a glass of wine, I whispered to myself, "He thinks he's won. Let him think that for now." It wasn't just bitterness speaking. It was clarity. I knew then that this story wasn't over. Harold had crossed a line he couldn't uncross, and though I didn't have a plan yet, part of me already sensed where this was heading. He'd taken my job, but he'd just given me my reason. After that email exchange, I thought things might quiet down. I'd made my stance clear, professional, polite, and final. But with Harold, silence was never peace. It was strategy. About a week later, I started receiving messages from former colleagues, people I'd trained and mentored for years. One of them, Jenna, texted me late one night, "Hey, I thought you should know. Harold's been telling everyone you left things unfinished. He said the clients are angry because you didn't prepare proper handover files." I stared at the message, a tightness forming in my chest. It was one thing for Harold to lie to clients. That was business politics. But spreading rumors to the team I'd helped build? That was personal. I thanked Jenna and told her not to get involved. Still, the damage was done. Harold was rewriting the story, painting me as negligent, while his nephew stumbled through the work I'd once handled with ease. Over the next month, the fallout from Kyle's incompetence became impossible to ignore. Clients began posting subtle complaints online. Delayed campaigns, poor communication, lost deliverables. I watched from the sidelines, torn between anger and disbelief. But then the situation escalated. One morning, I received a call from one of my oldest clients, a small but loyal retail brand I'd managed since my early days at the agency. The owner, a kind older woman named Denise, sounded exhausted. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I can't seem to get hold of Harold or Kyle. We paid for the new campaign weeks ago and nothing's happened. I know you're not with them anymore, but could you please check if something's wrong?" Her tone broke my heart. Denise wasn't just a client, she was a friend. We'd shared coffee after meetings, talked about our families, even celebrated her store's 10th anniversary together. I hesitated before answering. "Denise, I wish I could help, but I'm not part of the company anymore." There was a pause, then a sigh. I figured, "It hasn't been the same without you, dear. That new boy, what's his name? Kyle? He keeps calling our brand dated, said he wants to modernize our image. I don't think he's even looked at our market research." My jaw tightened. "He said that to you?" She laughed softly, but it wasn't amusement. "Yes. I told him we cater to middle-aged women. He said, 'Well, that's the problem, isn't it?'" The sheer disrespect in that statement burned through me. Denise's brand had built the agency's early reputation. She'd trusted us when no one else would. And this smug child who didn't know the first thing about brand loyalty had insulted her to her face. After we hung up, I sat in silence for a long time. Every story I heard about Kyle was worse than the last. Missed deadlines, overpromised deliverables, even a lost ad buy that cost a client thousands. But the worst part? Harold defended him every time. In an industry where reputation is everything, he doubled down on nepotism. He blamed the previous management, meaning me,
for every failure, and when clients started leaving, he claimed it was because I had poached them. The audacity was almost laughable. Then came the breaking point. I received a letter from a law firm representing the agency accusing me of intellectual property theft for using campaign materials that I had created. They demanded I cease and desist from sharing or reproducing any of the templates that I had personally developed. It was a thinly veiled threat, but the intention was clear: intimidation. I remember sitting at my desk, holding that letter in my hands, feeling an odd mix of fury and disbelief. Harold had fired me, humiliated me, stolen my credit, and now he wanted to scare me into silence. For a brief moment, I wondered if I should just walk away completely, start fresh, forget the past. But then I thought of Denise and the other clients still stuck there, being manipulated by a man who valued power over principle. That's when something in me hardened. Harold didn't just take my job, he had tried to take my integrity. And I wasn't going to let him win that easily. I called a law friend of mine, a woman named Clara, who'd helped me review contracts in the past. After reading through my employment papers, she laughed and said, "He has no case. In fact, it looks like he's the one in trouble." Her words reignited something inside me. For the first time in months, I smiled. Because if Harold wanted to play dirty, I was more than capable of playing smart. And I had something he didn't: the respect and trust of the people who actually mattered. It was time to stop mourning what I'd lost and start thinking about what I could build. But I knew Harold wouldn't back down easily, and as I was about to find out, his arrogance would push him to make one final, unforgivable mistake. It happened on an ordinary Thursday morning, the kind of day you never expect to become a turning point. I was sitting in a small cafe downtown, laptop open, drafting ideas for my new consulting business. The air smelled of coffee beans and rain. Outside, the city was waking up in a quiet hum. Then my phone buzzed. It was Jenna again. "You won't believe what just happened. Harold's meltdown is all over the client Slack channel." I blinked, rereading the message. I hadn't been in that Slack group since I left. Harold had made sure of that, but Jenna still had access. "What happened?" I typed back. A moment later, she replied with a flurry of screenshots. And there it was, a full-blown, unfiltered argument between Harold and one of the firm's biggest clients, a luxury home developer we'd landed years ago through painstaking effort. The client had posted, in front of the entire team, "This is unacceptable. Your new project manager, Kyle, has missed every deadline and submitted incomplete materials. I've tried to reach you privately, but you've ignored me. If this is the new level of service, we'll be terminating our contract effective immediately." Harold's response was astonishing. Instead of apologizing, he snapped back with arrogance. "Our agency doesn't need clients who refuse to adapt. Your outdated approach is the reason your brand is failing. We're focused on innovation." The client replied only once more. "Then you'll be innovating without our $400,000 campaign." I could almost feel the silence that must have followed. Within minutes, word spread like wildfire through the professional circles I'd spent years building. By noon, 3 more clients had publicly withdrawn their accounts. Harold had always been proud, too proud. But this was professional suicide. Still, I didn't celebrate, not yet, because arrogance like his rarely collapses quietly. It lashes out one last time before it crumbles. Sure enough, 2 days later, I received another email from Harold himself. The subject line read, "You win." It was short, bitter, and full of venom. It said, "I hope you're happy. Everything is falling apart, and the team thinks you orchestrated this. You've poisoned people against me, and I won't forget it. You've made an enemy out of someone who knows how to destroy reputations." I read it twice, then once more slower. My pulse didn't quicken this time. Instead, a quiet calm settled over me, the kind that comes when you finally stop fearing someone who no longer has any power over you. I replied with a single sentence, "The truth doesn't need my help to come out, Harold." And that was it. The final thread between us snapped. But as much as I wanted to move on, life wasn't finished teaching me something deeper. A few weeks later, I ran into one of the senior partners who'd remained silent during my firing, a man named Richard, who had always kept to himself. He asked to meet for coffee. When we sat down, he sighed, rubbing his temples. He said, "I owe you an apology. We all do. Harold convinced us you were difficult, that you didn't cooperate with the new structure. I should have known better." I didn't know what to say. I just listened. He continued, "He's under investigation now. Several clients filed formal complaints. There's talk of embezzlement, invoices paid to fake vendors, and those fake vendors all linked to Kyle." The words hit me like a sudden gust of cold air. Embezzlement, fraud, nepotism had turned into something much darker. Richard looked genuinely regretful. "If you ever want to come back when this is cleaned up..." I shook my head. "Thank you, but no. I think I've learned everything I needed from that place." He smiled faintly. "Honestly, that's probably wise." When I left the cafe, I stood on the street for a long time, watching the traffic pass. For the first time, I didn't feel anger or resentment, just relief. The man who had tried to destroy my reputation was finally facing the consequences of his own arrogance, and I hadn't lifted a finger. Justice doesn't always need to be loud. Sometimes it unfolds quietly, like a storm that clears the air after months of suffocating heat. But even though Harold's empire was falling, my story wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about rebuilding, reclaiming my sense of purpose and peace after so much manipulation and loss. And as fate would have it, the moment I stopped looking back, a new door opened in front of me. After that meeting with Richard, something inside me shifted. For the first time in months, I stopped feeling like a casualty of Harold's arrogance and started feeling like a strategist again. I went home that evening, made a cup of tea, and sat at my kitchen table surrounded by a small stack of notebooks, old client records, and scribbled business ideas. The same table where just a few months ago I'd cried over my termination letter was now my war room. That night, I didn't plan revenge. I planned rebirth. See, while Harold had spent years polishing his ego, I'd spent those same years quietly building relationships, real ones. I knew every client's pain points, their frustrations, their goals. They didn't just see me as a project manager, they saw me as a partner. And that, I realized, was my weapon. My unique weapon wasn't a contract loophole or some hidden evidence of wrongdoing. It was trust. Genuine, earned trust. The kind you can't fake or fabricate. But to wield it effectively, I needed to move carefully. I couldn't just start calling up clients and bad-mouthing Harold. That would make me look bitter or desperate. No, this needed to be subtle, almost invisible. So I started by reaching out to old contacts under a new pretext, consulting. I registered a small firm in my own name, Marion Strategies, and crafted a clean, minimalist website that reflected everything I wished my old agency had stood for. My tagline was simple: integrity, precision, partnership. Then I started publishing quiet thought pieces on LinkedIn, little essays about leadership, sustainable branding, and accountability in client relations. I didn't name names, but people could read between the lines. Within 2 weeks, a few of my old clients started liking and commenting on my posts. Then one messaged me privately, "Marion, are you consulting independently now? Because we might need to talk." I could almost feel the old fire reignite in my chest.
We met at a quiet restaurant downtown. It was the same developer Harold had insulted publicly, the one who'd canceled their $400,000 campaign. Honestly, I should have listened to you years ago. You were the only one who understood what we were trying to achieve. That company's a mess without you. We talked for an hour. By the time the check came, he leaned forward and said, "How soon can you start?" That first deal felt like oxygen after a long dive underwater. It wasn't just validation. It was the spark that lit the whole fire. I took on a second client the next week, and a third soon after that. Each one had something in common. They'd all left Harold's agency in frustration. I didn't have to chase them. They found me. But I wasn't careless. I refused to let bitterness guide me. My goal wasn't to destroy him. It was to build something stronger, something honest. But as my client list grew, it became clear that Harold's empire was crumbling faster than anyone expected. Jenna called me in the afternoon, laughing breathlessly. "You won't believe it. Harold had to let go half the staff. And guess who quit? Kyle. Apparently, he didn't want to deal with the fallout. He's trying to start over somewhere in tech." I smiled softly. "Poetic, isn't it?" She chuckled. "You always had the patience of a saint." But I wasn't a saint. I was just done being the kind of person who let arrogance go unchallenged. Because justice, I realized, doesn't always need to be loud. Sometimes it comes from quiet competence, from showing the world what true leadership looks like. So I kept building. I reinvested every dollar into better tools, better people, and transparent client communication. And slowly, word started spreading. The woman Harold fired built something better. That became my quiet legend. And as I watched his once flourishing agency bleed clients, it hit me. This wasn't revenge anymore. It was evolution. The empire Harold had built on arrogance was collapsing under its own weight. And mine, built on trust, integrity, and respect, was rising in its place. I didn't need to destroy him. He'd done that himself. But soon, there would come a day when our paths crossed again. And when it did, justice would finally step out of the shadows.
It began with a single email, one that would set everything in motion. By this point, Marion Strategies had grown from a small consultancy into a full-fledged creative agency. We had a modest office, a talented 5-person team, and a client list that kept expanding faster than I'd imagined. The irony? Nearly all of them were former clients of my old firm, Harold's firm. But this email was different. It came from one of the biggest real estate developers in the region, someone I'd never worked with directly before. The subject line read, "We're leaving Harlan & Co. Can we talk?" I froze. Harlan & Co. was Harold's company. When I opened the email, I saw the name David Lynn, a man I remembered from industry conferences. Sharp, meticulous, and notoriously difficult to impress. His message was brief. "We're looking for a new agency after multiple failed campaigns. Your name came up repeatedly in client recommendations. Let's schedule a call." That one line, "Your name came up repeatedly," told me everything I needed to know. My reputation had quietly eclipsed Harold's. Still, I played it cool. I replied professionally, suggesting a consultation later that week. When we met, David was direct. He said, "I don't want to sugarcoat this. He's worked with your old agency for 3 years. The last 6 months have been a nightmare. Missed deadlines, poor communication, overpromises, and frankly, I'm done." He leaned forward. "Tell me something, Marion. How do you do things differently?" I smiled slightly. "I listen," I said simply, "and I don't take on clients I can't serve well. My goal isn't to grow fast, it's to grow right." He nodded, considering that. Then, as if testing me, he said,
If you can deliver what you claim, I'll move my entire account to your firm. But I need proof, results, not promises. Challenge accepted. Over the next few weeks, my team and I poured ourselves into a pilot campaign. I was there for every strategy meeting, every late night revision, every client presentation. It wasn't easy. We were small, and the project was huge, but it felt right. And when the results came in, they spoke for themselves. Engagement metrics tripled. The developer's brand visibility skyrocketed. A month later, I received a short message from David. We're officially transferring all contracts to Marion Strategies, effective immediately. I sat at my desk for a long time after reading that. The room was quiet, except for the hum of the air conditioner. My heart was steady, calm, strong. That's when I realized this was the moment. I didn't need to go after Harold. I just needed to exist, to thrive in a space he'd taken for granted. But fate wasn't done twisting the knife. A week later, I attended a regional marketing summit, one I'd signed up for months ago. As I walked into the ballroom, coffee in hand, I saw him. Harold. He was standing near the registration desk, talking animatedly to a couple of attendees. His once polished demeanor looked frayed. His suit was a little wrinkled, his voice slightly too loud. When he saw me, he froze mid-sentence. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smirked, that familiar, arrogant curl of the lip. Well, if it isn't Marion! Still playing the underdog, I see? I smiled, not forced, just calm. Actually, Harold, I'm speaking at the afternoon panel. They asked me to share how small firms can thrive in competitive markets. The flicker in his eyes was worth 1,000 words. Oh, he said lightly, masking his discomfort. Good for you. We exchanged a few more empty pleasantries, but the tension between us was palpable. When he finally walked away, I exhaled slowly. Later that afternoon, I stood at the podium, speaking to an audience of hundreds. My presentation wasn't about revenge. It was about rebuilding trust in leadership, about integrity in business. But I caught Harold in the crowd, sitting stiffly in the back row, eyes fixed on me. And when I ended my talk with, "Sometimes losing everything you thought you defined is the best thing that could happen," I saw his jaw tighten. That was my victory. Not the applause that followed, but the quiet, undeniable truth that echoed in his silence. By the time the event ended, I'd been approached by 3 new potential clients, one of whom mentioned they were re-evaluating their contract with Harlan & Co. It was poetic, really. The man who fired me to make room for his nephew was now watching me take everything he'd built, not out of vengeance, but because people finally saw what real leadership looks like. As I walked out of the venue into the soft evening light, I felt a deep, grounded satisfaction. Justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand tall. And I was standing taller than I had ever been.
2 weeks after that conference, I got a call I hadn't expected, from Jenna. Her voice was trembling with barely contained excitement. "Marion," she said breathlessly, "you're not going to believe what's happening at Harlan & Co." I leaned back in my chair, smiling faintly. "Let me guess," I said. "Harold finally realized hiring his nephew wasn't a sustainable business model." She laughed, but it was edged with disbelief. "Worse, way worse. The audit's out, the one the investors ordered after all those client complaints. Turns out Kyle created fake vendor accounts and paid himself over $200,000 in consulting fees. For a moment, I said nothing. The satisfaction was sharp, almost electric, but it wasn't joy. It was something deeper, quieter. Closure. Jenna continued, her words tumbling over themselves. Harold tried to claim he didn't know, but the investigators found his signature on half the invoices. The board suspended him this morning. HR's already locked him out of the system. I exhaled slowly, staring out the window. The city stretched before me. Endless movement, people going about their lives, completely unaware of the poetic justice unfolding in one corner of it. Marion, she said breathlessly, you're not going to believe what's happening at Harland & Co. I leaned back in my chair, smiling faintly. Let me guess, I said. Harold finally realized hiring his nephew wasn't a sustainable business model. She laughed, but it was edged with disbelief. Worse, way worse. The audit's out, the one the investors ordered after all those client complaints. Turns out Kyle created fake vendor accounts and paid himself over $200,000 in consulting fees. For a moment, I said nothing. The satisfaction was sharp, almost electric, but it wasn't joy. It was something deeper, quieter. Closure. Jenna continued, her words tumbling over themselves. Harold tried to claim he didn't know, but the investigators found his signature on half the invoices. The board suspended him this morning. HR's already locked him out of the system. I exhaled slowly, staring out the window. The city stretched before me. Endless movement, people going about their lives, completely unaware of the poetic justice unfolding in one corner of it. Marion, she said breathlessly, you're not going to believe what's happening at Harland & Co. I leaned back in my chair, smiling faintly. Let me guess, I said. Harold finally realized hiring his nephew wasn't a sustainable business model. She laughed, but it was edged with disbelief. Worse, way worse. The audit's out, the one the investors ordered after all those client complaints. Turns out Kyle created fake vendor accounts and paid himself over $200,000 in consulting fees. For a moment, I said nothing. The satisfaction was sharp, almost electric, but it wasn't joy. It was something deeper, quieter. Closure. Jenna continued, her words tumbling over themselves. Harold tried to claim he didn't know, but the investigators found his signature on half the invoices. The board suspended him this morning. HR's already locked him out of the system. I exhaled slowly, staring out the window. The city stretched before me. Endless movement, people going about their lives, completely unaware of the poetic justice unfolding in one corner of it. Jenna, I said softly, you know, I used to think I'd never feel peace until I saw him fall, but now I just feel sorry for him. There was a pause on the line. You're a better person than I am, she finally said. I smiled faintly. No, I just finally understand that people like Harold always destroy themselves. You don't have to lift a finger, you just have to get out of their way. Later that day, I got an email, a short, almost pitiful message from Harold himself. The subject line read, "You were right." My stomach tightened. I hovered over the message for a long time before opening it. Inside, his words were uneven, the tone completely stripped of arrogance. I thought I was untouchable. I thought bringing family into the business would make me look powerful. Instead, it ruined me. The clients you brought in, the systems you built, they were the only things holding this place together. I didn't see it until it was gone. I'm sorry. It wasn't an apology I ever expected, and it didn't erase what he'd done. But reading it, I felt something loosen in my chest. I typed a reply, simple and final. I hope you learn from this. I already have. Then I hit send,
and closed that chapter of my life for good. But the story didn't end there. The industry noticed. Within a month, trade publications were buzzing about the collapse of Harland & Co., a once promising agency brought down by greed and nepotism. One article even mentioned me by name, citing how a former executive, ousted in a leadership shakeup, went on to found one of the fastest-growing boutique firms in the region. The poetic symmetry of it all wasn't lost on me. Harold had built his reputation on taking credit for others' work. I had built mine on doing the work and letting results speak for themselves. And now his empire was dust, while mine was thriving. The final piece of the downfall came quietly, almost anticlimactically. A former mutual colleague called me one evening. "Did you hear?" he said. "Harold filed for bankruptcy. The company's being dissolved. He's moving out of state." I thanked him, hung up, and just sat there for a while in silence. No victory dance, no vindictive smile, just peace. He had taken everything from me once, my position, my stability, my confidence. But in losing all that, I had found something infinitely more valuable: freedom. And justice, in its most perfect form, was poetic. The man who fired me to make room for his nephew was now jobless, disgraced, and forgotten. Meanwhile, I'd taken his clients, his reputation, and the future he thought he'd stolen from me and turned it into something better. It was over. Completely. Irrevocably over. I shut down my laptop, poured myself a glass of wine, and stood by the window watching the city lights flicker. This was what closure felt like. Not triumph, not revenge, but balance restored. A few months after Harold's downfall, I stood in the lobby of a glass-fronted building with my name etched in silver letters across the entrance. Marion Strategies, Creative Integrity in Motion. The sight made my chest tighten. For a long moment, I just stood there, letting it sink in. Every late night, every setback, every tear I'd swallowed, it had all led here. Inside, the space was alive with quiet energy. My small team had grown into a bustling family of 20. Designers, strategists, writers, all people who believed in the same values I did: honesty, accountability, respect. The morning sunlight poured across the open floor plan, landing on a framed quote I'd hung near the entrance. "The best revenge is building something that can't be destroyed." I smiled every time I saw it. At 10 sharp, my assistant Mia poked her head into my office. "Your 10:30 is on their way up, the developer from Crestpoint Holdings." "Perfect," I said. "Bring them into the conference room when they arrive." This meeting was big. Crestpoint was one of the largest property development firms in the state, the kind of client Harold used to brag about at every industry mixer. Now they were coming to me. When the CEO arrived, he shook my hand warmly. "I have to say," he began, "I've heard nothing but good things about you, Marion. Your work with the Lynn campaign was exceptional. We want that same precision for our rebranding project." I smiled, composed, but inwardly glowing. "Thank you. We'd love to bring that same energy to your team." As the meeting began, I couldn't help noticing the irony. Crestpoint had once been Harold's prized client, the one he claimed no one else could handle. They'd left him, quietly, after the scandals, and found their way to me. Halfway through the discussion, the CEO mentioned something almost poetic. "You know," he said, flipping through his notes, "your old firm reached out to us again last month. I didn't even take the call. After what happened over there, I couldn't risk it. I told my assistant, find me the woman who used to make them look good." I laughed softly. Well, I'm glad she found me. The rest of the meeting went beautifully. By the end, we'd sealed a deal that would double my firm's annual revenue. After they left, I sat in my chair for a moment, looking out the window at the city skyline. Somewhere out there, Harold was probably reading the same industry news I was. Stories about Marion's strategies rising fast, setting new benchmarks for client trust and creative results. He
Would know. He had to know. But instead of satisfaction, what I felt was gratitude. Gratitude that he'd pushed me out when he did. Gratitude that his arrogance had forced me to discover who I could be without him holding me back. He thought firing me was his power move, but it turned out to be my liberation. That afternoon, I called an all-hands meeting. The team gathered in the open space near the big windows. The mood was light, expectant. "Everyone," I said, "I just want to thank you. A year ago, this company was nothing but an idea on a notepad. And now, we've built something that stands for everything the industry forgot: honesty, collaboration, and real partnership." They applauded, smiling, clapping each other on the back. As the noise faded, I added, "Let's keep growing. Not by being the biggest, but by being the best." That became our company motto. Later that night, when the office emptied out and the city lights began to shimmer against the glass, I poured myself a quiet drink and walked through the hallways. The hum of computers, the faint smell of fresh paper and coffee, it was the sound of everything I'd built with my own two hands. At my desk, I opened an old folder labeled Harlan & Co., 2017 to 2022. For a brief second, I skimmed the names, the old invoices, the client lists. Then, with a slow smile, I dragged it into the recycle bin and hit delete. A small act, but one that felt like the final exhale of a long, painful chapter. This was my empire now. Built not on manipulation, but on merit. Not on family favors, but on faith. In myself, and in doing things the right way. As I turned off the lights and walked out into the night, the city air felt warm and alive. Justice, I realized, isn't always loud or cruel. Sometimes it's simply living well after someone bet against you and proving they never stood a chance. It's been 3 years since that final meeting, since the last echoes of Harold's empire faded into memory. I often think about how strange life can be, how the very thing that once felt like my ruin became the foundation for everything I cherish now. My company, Marion Strategies, continues to thrive. We've expanded to a second office in another city with clients reaching out from places I used to only dream of working with. But beyond the growth in the numbers, what makes me proudest is the culture we've built, one rooted in mutual respect, not fear. When I walk through the office these days, I see collaboration instead of competition, laughter instead of exhaustion. I see young professionals who feel seen and valued, the very environment I used to crave but never found under Harold's leadership. It's peaceful here, stable, and for the first time in my career, I wake up without that anxious pit in my stomach, wondering what disaster or manipulation might unfold next. Every now and then, someone mentions Harold, usually in passing, a faint memory from another lifetime. The last I heard, he'd moved to a smaller town and was doing freelance consulting under a different name. Rumor had it he tried starting another agency but couldn't get funding. Investors were wary after the scandal. And strangely, I wish him well. Because wishing ill would mean I'm still carrying him with me, and I'm not. I've learned that real justice isn't about seeing someone else suffer. It's about living freely, no longer defined by their damage. I've also learned something important about power. It doesn't come from titles or offices or control. It comes from integrity, from the quiet confidence of knowing who you are when everything else is stripped away. One afternoon, I received a handwritten note at the office. There was no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Harold's. Inside, it simply said, "I saw your interview in the business journal. You built something remarkable. I didn't see your worth then, but I do now. I hope you keep leading with grace, something I never learned how to do." I sat with that letter for a long while. Then I placed it in my desk drawer. Not as a keepsake of him, but as a reminder of how far I'd come. Because the truth is, I don't owe my success to Harold's failure. I owe it to the woman I became after he tried to break me. That's the real victory, not the clients I took or the empire I built, but the peace that came from reclaiming my voice and my dignity. Today, when I mentor younger women in business, I tell them this: don't let anyone convince you that being kind means being weak. Integrity may not make you loud, but it will make you unshakable. And every time I say it, I feel a quiet pride, the kind that doesn't fade with applause or recognition. Because I know, deep down, I lived through betrayal, injustice, and humiliation, and turned all of it into something unbreakable. I built an empire not out of revenge, but out of resilience. And in that, I found not just success, but serenity. As I close my office each evening and watch the sunset bathe the city in gold, I whisper a small truth to myself, one that carries all the weight and wisdom of my journey. Sometimes the best justice is simply outgrowing the person who tried to bury you. And with that, I turn off the lights, walk out into the night, and smile. Because my story isn't one of vengeance anymore. It's one of victory.